housing, energy, mobility, they all are kind of treated separately. But one of the things, the takeaway for me at this conference was really they have to start looking at them as a whole. Ruth Cox, why don't you tell us what your takeaway is?
Well, I do want to say that there were a lot of great speakers today who talked about real life experiences in trying to create smart cities and implement programs that will provide infrastructure to deliver smart city services. The conclusion that you have to have an integrated approach to energy and transportation and housing or the built environment is accurate, and that's really what Prospect Silicon Valley does. Those are the three areas that we focus on. And in particular, we focus on those aspects of the built environment and those aspects of energy that relate to the transportation sector. That has always been our core strength. So when you talk about vehicle-to-grid integration, for buses that are massive batteries and they're talking about hundreds of them, you really have to deal with the energy side of that equation and the grid interface, right? So that's just one example.
Yeah, and we heard, I think it was 56 megawatts is how much it would require to run the VTA here in Santa Clara County if you electrified it.
I think that's even probably low when you think about it. But one of the interesting things that VTA is doing, they have a lot of solar panels on their facility. And right now the solar is pushed back into the grid, and what they want to do is they want to implement battery storage systems so that they can actually take advantage of the stored energy during those peak hours when energy is number one scarce and number two expensive. So this is just another example of bringing these different areas together, for the purposes of serving the community.
Well, and one of the things, about the VTA that I thought was pretty big announcement was Mayor Liccardo mentioning that they're looking at how they can use existing rights-of-way to do autonomous buses where you normally have, say, a light railers.
And the question is are light rail cars really the optimal way to use that space? Or would we be better off with autonomous buses? We can imagine how autonomous buses might operate along light rail lines. And the first generation stay clearly within those confines, and the second generation might have those autonomous buses making left and right turns off of the main lines to deliver folks to higher quality destinations. We can see there are great opportunities here, and look forward to exploring them with you.
Their ridership has dropped, and one of the reasons is because there's not enough flexible and cost-effective solutions for the first and last mile to get people onto the public transit backbone. So when he was talking about taking a different approach, that kind of fixed rail, lots of cars may not be the kind of flexible solution that we're going to need for the future. And certainly we're not going to need massive buses for first and last mile services. And so they're really working hard to reorient themselves to make sure that they can deliver on their responsibilities to the public, because they're the ones, as a public sector entity, as a public agency, to make sure that everyone gets served, not just the wealthy communities.
How does VTA need to restructure itself to become a leaner, better organization that is better supporting the customer?
Well, and you discussed this, but it was also the idea of mobility managers instead of necessarily owning everything, right? You kind of manage it.
Yeah, and so they may not do everything by themselves. I mean, they may need to learn how to collaborate with some of these, what I guess they call TNCs, right? The Ubers and the Lyfts, and so they'll be part of the solution. There's no question about it. But the VTA has to modify its approach as well.
Yeah, and it all gets back to that housing and the walkability and things like that. The presentation from Panasonic with what they're doing at the Pena station was really fascinating.
Yeah, they are doing some amazing work, and I think the issue there is that with urbanization happening, you have an opportunity to re-engineer your urban areas. So as population is growing, to start building your housing in an approximate way to your public transit options. And that's what needs to happen. And I saw it happen personally when I lived in Washington, D.C., and they built out the metro system. And in particular, in the metro system in Northern Virginia, which is very suburban, much like what we have here in the Valley, right? And they started building at those subway stops, or I guess you call it a subway. They started building high-rise housing and all kinds of commercial buildings for stores. People could go shopping and do all kinds of things very close to the transit hub. So yeah, we need to see more of that happening here. And you see a little bit happening, but more needs to happen. We're not going to be able to accommodate the growth without those kinds of solutions.
Well, and it was fun, just some of these alternative mobility, the Swift Mile out there and so forth. You're not always talking about autonomous vehicles, but they all kind of change what you need for parking and everything, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, I think when you're living in a city and it's only a mile or two to get to your job, it's great to be able to ride a bike. I can remember riding a bike for years when I lived in Washington when I was younger. I wore dresses and heels and still rode my bike to work, And they started using bike services, I think, before we did out here. Mm-hmm. And I was able to use them there. You got to make all the options available, right? It can't just be automobiles. And one thing that came across very clear today, and I've been saying, in my role here at Prospect for a long time now, you can't just replace internal combustion engine vehicles with autonomous vehicles or even electric vehicles, because that is not going to solve the traffic congestion problem, right? You really need to rethink your strategy for shared mobility services and for those first and last mile services that are going to enable use of the public transit backbone.
And that's what we heard from Waymo, that their focus is on share a ride, right?
Yeah, and look at Ford. Ford is redefining itself as a mobility services company, which is amazing for a company that size. And I have a great admiration for their CEO and chairman, who I've had an opportunity to meet, to take on that task. It's a really difficult thing to do.
Well, and it is. It's mobility. They're not just focused on automobiles, right?
That's right. They aren't. And go bikes, right? You see the Ford logo on a go bike. The first time I saw it, I was stunned. Yeah. So
it's a new world, but it looks like ProspectSV is right in the middle of it all. So Ruth, thank you for this great conference.
Well, thank you for joining us and for helping us with the video. And we're glad that you were here.